production was a crucial step towards strengthening our domestic supply chains, as in the Washington Accords. In 2023 and again in 2025, I held a series of hearings highlighting the greatest beneficiaries of the conflict and critical minerals system, China's state-owned mining companies. And we can't remain silent. We've got to confront this, and I have introduced legislation, H.R. 2310, the Cobalt Supply Chain Act, which ensures that goods made using or containing cobalt refined in the PRC do not enter the United States market under the presumption that the cobalt is extracted or processed with the use of child and forced labor in the DRC.
Je ne sais pas si je
We
dois
had 4 hearings on it.
commenter
We
ou
heard from
bien
people who
qu'est-ce que
said,
je dois
this is what it's
faire.
doing to the kids. Anywhere from 25 to 40,000 children who are working in these artisanal mines and also are getting sick. Sometimes the mine collapses, sometimes they die. And of course, the adults, are upwards of 200,000, are being coerced in these mines by the Chinese Communist Party to produce. And where does it all go? It goes to Xinjiang, a place where genocide is taking place under Xi Jinping. So that has to end, and it has to end now. Hopefully this agreement will preclude the need for such a bill, but if not, we've got to pass that legislation and end our complicity when you buy an EV that has been made with child labor in the DR Congo. I'd like to yield to Ms. Jacobs for the opening comment.
Non, je ne pourrais pas traduire, c'est beaucoup de
Well,
gens qui
thank
parlent
you,
à la
Chairman
fois.
Smith, for holding this hearing so we can hear from a panel of non-government witnesses after hearing from the State Department last month. And thank you to all of our witnesses for testifying before our committee today. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is facing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, with 7.3 million internally displaced persons and over 7,000 people killed in 2025 alone. More than 26 million people are experiencing life-threatening levels of acute food insecurity. It's one of the most complex and long-standing humanitarian crises in the world. While the latest escalation between DRC and Rwanda started in 2022, various forms of conflict in eastern DRC have been ongoing for the last 3 decades. And civilians have suffered the most under the current conflict, either being caught in the crossfire or being targeted by armed groups. Conflict-related sexual violence has reached epidemic levels in eastern DRC. Cases have continued to escalate this year, while impunity for its perpetrators, including the M23 and other armed groups and military forces, prevails. So, I do appreciate President Trump's high-level attention to this conflict that is too often ignored and put on the back burner. And I hope that that attention is sustained and not fleeting. But frankly, I have been offended by the president's statements that he has already ended the war between the DRC and Rwanda. We can all see that there is, in fact, no peace or stability on the ground at all. I've also been extremely concerned that the lack of consultation and inclusion of civil society and local communities is setting up the peace process to fail before it even gets off the ground. Only 5 days after the signing of the Washington Accords between President Tshisekedi and President Kagame, hosted by President Trump, the M23, co-located with the Rwandan military along the front lines, took over the strategic city of Uvira in South Kivu. And while M23 has partially retreated from Uvira, we still have not seen the full retreat to 75 kilometers outside of Uvira back to Kamanyola as the United States called for in December. This is all on top of nearly a year of M23's occupation of Goma and Bukavu, 2 other extremely important cities in the Kivus, where civilians have faced atrocities, executions, and other abuses. And let me be clear, both parties have made commitments that they have failed to maintain. Rwanda clearly continues to support the M23 and deploy its own forces, the latest numbers ranging from 5,000 to 7,000 troops in eastern Congo, not including the latest Uvira offensive in violation of the DRC sovereignty. And the DRC military, for its part, has reportedly continued collaboration with the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, a militia founded by the leaders of the 1994 Rwanda genocide in contravention of the Accords. And despite Secretary Rubio and Ambassador Walz's promises 2 months ago that they would use all the tools at our disposal to hold Rwanda accountable and, quote, ensure promises made by Rwanda to the president are kept, the administration has still not announced any new sanctions or accountability measures against Rwanda or the M23. Just as I did last month during our hearing with the State Department, I urge the Trump administration to immediately make good on its promises to hold Rwanda and other spoilers to peace accountable. I also urge the administration to course correct its exclusion of civil society from the peace process. Several studies have shown over the years that peace deals are more durable and lasting when civil society is involved, including a study that showed involving civil society reduces the risk of peace breaking down by 64%. So we need the buy-in of local populations to ensure peace actually sticks. We also need to consult local populations on the various commercial deals in progress with the government of DRC to ensure that investments actually benefit the Congolese people, not just foreign companies and elites. And I continue to be alarmed by the devastating impacts of foreign assistance cuts in the DRC, and I urge the Trump administration to reverse these cuts and invest in new programs immediately. Earlier this year, Secretary Rubio and Doge cut hundreds of millions of dollars in assistance to the DRC as part of President Trump's sham foreign assistance review and illegal dismantling of USAID. Since the cuts to USAID, more than 8,200 people living in the DRC with HIV have lost access to life-saving treatment. Last year, there was a 62% increase in deaths due to cholera. And while there has been a surge in conflict-related sexual violence in Eastern Congo, foreign assistance cuts have reduced the services available to survivors, including post-rape kits. And just in November, the World Food Program was forced to cut the number of people it assisted in DRC in half, from 1 million to 600,000 people. These cuts didn't make sense then, and they certainly don't make sense now, while the president talks about the need for peace and saving lives in DRC. This isn't charity. The humanitarian crisis, weak governance, and exploitation taking place will continue to further exacerbate grievances and conflict if not addressed. I would like the president's peace agenda to be successful, but it's hard to believe it will be after he gutted our foreign policy tools and neglected to dedicate the necessary senior staff and resources to make peace not just possible, but enduring. Meanwhile, the Congolese have not seen peace, only escalation over the past year, and they don't have time to wait. We need immediate action to hold the M23 and Rwanda accountable for their occupation in DRC and latest offensive in Uvira. We need immediate action to get the peace process back on track so that both the DRC and Rwanda uphold the commitments they have made, and we need the administration to invest in its own institutions and tools so that this process is successful. The Congolese people have endured violence, exploitation, and promises of peace for long enough. I strongly urge the United States, along with the rest of the international community, to recommit to this peace process and demonstrate seriousness about holding spoilers to peace accountable. So I look forward to hearing from our expert witness panel to hear their perspectives and recommendations for Congress and the Trump administration to realize lasting peace in the DRC. Thank you, Chairman Smith. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Without objection, if any of our other panelists would like to submit a statement for the record, it would be so ordered. And then I would like to introduce our distinguished witnesses. Beginning first with Ethan Tan, who is a policy analyst for American security at the America First Policy Institute. He has written extensively on these issues, brings to bear a keen understanding of what is going on in Africa, and especially now in the DR Congo. And I thank him very much for taking the time to be here. Your full vitae will be made a part of the record. I also want to introduce Tony Hall, former congressman from Ohio, 24 years as a member of the House, and then 10 years before that as a member of the legislature. He is known and respected deeply for his work that he led so ably on here in the Congress and the House and Senate on hunger. He became our ambassador on hunger and served out of Rome for 3 years. I visited him there, and I was just amazed at how, not surprised, how well respected he was by his peers, because he brings a sense of urgency, comprehensive application of humanitarian law to everything he does. We've traveled many times together along with Frank Wolf, and I just want to thank Tony again for doing this. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. I think he should have gotten it. I mean, he is all about feeding the hungry and taking the words given to us by our Lord, "When I was hungry, did you feed me?" And he's done that his entire career and his entire life. Then we'll hear from Christian Gerard Nima. a non-resident scholar
Non,
of the
non,
Africa
c'est
Program
leur
for the
son à eux,
Carnegie
ça, c'est
Endowment
pas
for
moi.
International
Leur son
Peace.
à eux, c'est comme ça,
And
c'est
again, your
à
full
l'extrême.
resume will be made a
Je
part of the
peux
record, but I
essayer
want
de
to thank
voir
you
si
for
ça va
coming.
vous aider.
And
Je
Mr.
pense que
Mr.
leur
Tan,
son à eux est
the floor
comme
is
ça.
yours.
Ce n'est pas moi qui suis en
Chairman
train de
Smith,
toucher leur son.
Ranking Member Jacobs,
Donc il y a un
distinguished
témoin qui va
members of the
parler.
subcommittee.
Si ça dépendait de
Thank you for the
moi, je ne pourrais
opportunity
pas être
to
voir, mais
discuss the United States
c'est à eux,
efforts
leur son
to
à
further
eux est
peace
comme ça.
between
C'est ça le
democratic-
maximum qu'ils peuvent avoir. Suivons un peu les témoins qui est là-bas et puis je vais revenir après. Suivant. Hein?
My name is Ethan Tan, and I serve
Tu
as a
vois, même moi
policy
je n'entends
analyst
pas.
on the
Tu vois, il
American
parle
American
très
Security
lentement.
Team
Son
at
micro
the
est
American
tellement
First
bas.
Policy Institute. Since the 1990s, armed conflict has burdened the eastern regions
Je
of the
n'entends
DRC,
pas. Voilà.
and
C'est ça le
repeated
problème.
efforts to resolve the conflict have failed,
Un instant,
stalling
je vais
economic
voir.
growth
Son son
and
est
allowing
trop bas.
hostile actors to exploit the region's vast natural resources, all while blocking the United States from entering
Non,
critical mineral supply
mais
chains.
je ne peux rien faire.
The United
C'est son
States
son à lui
recognizes
qui est
the
aussi bas comme
implications
cela.
of these
C'est pas ce
long-standing
qu'on va faire.
conflicts, and as a result, has led the movement towards a
Peut-être
more
ils vont
holistic
arranger
approach.
d'un moment à l'autre. Hein.
The
Vous
United
avez
States
vu
has long
notre
played a role
sœur
in
Ariane
supporting
Veras
peace efforts
derrière,
across
non?
Africa
Elle est là, vous
through
pouvez la voir,
diplomatic
elle est
efforts,
derrière.
and the Washington
Il y a des
Accords
Congolais qui
are no
sont aussi
different.
là-bas.
The framework mediates beyond the scope
voilà,
of past
donc c'est
deals,
ça, vous
working
pouvez
in
voir.
tandem with the Doha framework signed last November and involves regional
Mais c'est
oversight from
difficile
the African
d'entendre,
Union.
c'est très loin, même moi je n'entends pas. Donc,
Integrating each element into
n'écrivez
the
pas
accords
volume,
begins a
écoutez-moi
new
qui vous
chapter
parle
for the
déjà là.
conflict.
C'est difficile
One
d'entendre ce
with
qu'ils disent
genuine
là.
hope for a peaceful
Le son est
resolution
trop bas
for
pour
the
eux,
first
pas pour
time in
moi.
decades.
Pour eux. Et pour nous tous,
Peace
le
is
son est trop
fragile,
bas.
and
Chez
fighting
moi, je ne peux
persists in
rien
the
faire.
east, most notably in South Kivu and the city of Uvira. Coordination with civil societies in the DRC and Rwanda, as well as partners in the African Union, is paramount to the Accord's future successes. Nonetheless, in the 2 months since the signing of the Accords, there have already been multiple wins, including regular meetings between officials for the DRC and Rwanda, implementation of African Union oversight teams along the eastern border, the creation of a framework for future joint infrastructure products, and acknowledgement from the Rwandan government that they have been engaged in security coordination with M23. U.S. diplomatic efforts have worked. U.S. officials have been credited with successfully pressuring Rwanda and M23 to
Il
withdraw
parle
from
de
their positions in
M23 et le
Uvira,
Rwanda qui ont travaillé en
reinforcing their
collaboration
commitment
pour
to helping
traverser la
the
frontière et
DRC
entrer au Congo
retain its
démocratique.
territorial integrity. Subsequent aggressions will not be tolerated, and the State Department has been vocal about pursuing sanctions should they continue. These developments reduce risks to U.S. interests in critical minerals from Africa,
Ces histoires
encapsulating
diminuent
key tenet
l'intérêt
of an American
des
first
investissements
foreign
américains au
policy,
Congo démocratique.
delivering tangible benefits to the American people. Stabilizing this region, a region that today contains over 70% of global cobalt, as well as
Il faut
proven
stabiliser
reserves
cette
of
région qui a
coltan,
70% de
copper,
cobalt mondial.
gold, lithium, and diamonds, secures American defense and manufacturing supply
Ça va
chains,
sécuriser la
and
défense
reduces
américaine
import reliance
aussi
from countries such as
quand il y a
China.
la paix dans cette région.
Investments from the United States into the DRC and Rwanda are not a side effect, but a welcome and
L'investissement
even
des
central aspect
États-Unis au
of
Congo et au
enduring
Rwanda,
peace. Officials from both countries have approached the U.S., citing the U.S.'s ability to integrate them within a larger regional framework and connect them to open markets in the West. The deepening of the cooperation between the United States and both countries on this issue means that our adversaries have a diminished presence. Agreements also lay the groundwork for future U.S. investment in infrastructure projects such as the Sakina-Libido Corridor and the Banana Deepwater Port. These projects also
il parle
seek to incorporate
d'investir
involvement
sur les
from neighboring
corridors de
countries,
Banana.
namely Burundi and Uganda. The inclusion of the rest of the Great Lakes region will greater enable accountability and create continuity across the region's economic landscape. Furthermore, the long-term stability in the region allows for diverting taxpayer dollars away from never-ending peacekeeping missions and back towards the American people.
Il parle
I want to thank each
du
of you for your
fait que
attention to
les
this important
États-Unis
issue
sera
and for the
perdant
subcommittee's
si
efforts
cette région n'est pas
supporting
dans la
prosperity
paix
in
et que
Africa.
cette guerre
While the
continue.
signing of the Washington Accords is a monumental
Pour les
moment in the
investissements des
conflict's
États-Unis au
history,
Congo
it is
démocratique
more than a
et même
formal
au Rwanda.
declaration. It is an urgent appeal for action. Thank you for allowing me to share my perspectives today.
Merci de m'avoir permis de
Thank you
parler.
very
de la
much,
situation.
Mr. Tan.
Tu vois, maintenant qu'elles
I'd like
sont
to now
implantées, c'est ça,
recognize
c'était pas
Ambassador
moi.
Tony Hall. I left this out, but I should have brought this out. He was one of the leaders, too, on trying to stop the importation of conflicted diamonds, blood diamonds,
Lui,
and I
il
want to
avait
thank him
été
for that.
parmi les gens qui avaient parlé
And
sur
I yield
les,
such time as he may consume.
les diamants, le sang des diamants, si vous vous rappelez. C'est celui-ci, c'est honorable Tony Hall. Mais tu vois, lui-même, quand il parle, on n'entend rien. Il n'y a même pas le son chez eux là-bas. On leur donne 5 minutes, mais tu vois qu'il n'a même pas allumé son micro. Donc, personne n'entend. Tu vois, il doit maintenant allumer le micro. Voilà, il doit approcher. On lui a dit. Non, ça continue toujours. Il doit allumer le micro. Oui, tu vois, on est parti, quelqu'un est parti l'aider. Donc, des fois, c'est
Is
comme
it
ça.
on?
On va essayer.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Can you hear me now?
Maintenant, on t'entend un peu, mais c'est trop bas.
Okay. It's nice to be back in the
Merci
Congress
d'être encore de
again.
retour.
It's been a while.
Ça a été beaucoup de temps depuis que je suis
And,
arrivé ici.
I remember in
Je me rappelle,
1983,
waouh, les sons
As I
est
look
tellement
around the
bas,
room,
vous n'avez
a
pas
lot
l'idée,
of
c'est pas
you
possible.
weren't
Pourquoi ils ont
even
fait un
born
truc
then.
comme ça?
and in 1983,
Je parle de
had a good friend that
1983.
used to come into my office, and
Quand j'étais dans mon bureau,
he would. I was kind of a new believer, and he would say, "Tony, don't you think it's time to
j'étais encore un nouveau croyant et j'ai dit, Tony, est-ce qu'il n'y a
into
pas moyen?
politics?" And I said, "No, I don't want to do that." I said because I don't like politicians that wear it on their sleeve, and then the next day they do something that's completely the opposite of it. I'd rather see a sermon than hear one.
OK.
But I said, I know what you mean. I know what
Il
you
raconte
mean,
d'abord
but
une
I
petite
don't know
histoire.
how
Hein?
to do that.
L'honorable
How do I
Tony,
bring
il parle
my
de la
faith
foi, de la croyance, il
into
raconte une
my
petite histoire.
politics and do it in a way in which I'm comfortable. And I had just become the chairman of the committee, the subcommittee on international hunger, and I went to the first place I went to was Ethiopia.
La première place que je suis parti, c'était en Éthiopie.
And Ethiopia was experiencing an amazing famine in those days.
L'Éthiopie a expérimenté
Civil
la
war,
famine
famine.
terrible.
And it was a tremendous problem. 1 million people
Il y avait
had
beaucoup de
died
millions de
even
personnes
before I got there. I was the first
qui dormaient et qui mouraient de la famine en
elected official to go to
Éthiopie.
Ethiopia in those days. I saw 25 children die one morning.
J'ai vu 25 enfants qui sont morts dans une
I
nuit
was traveling with Mother Teresa's group and
avec Madame
traveling up
Teresa.
country, and 10,000 people were running for their lives in this particular area. And, they were so tired from running because of the Civil War that they
Ils
all
étaient très
laid down.
fatigués de fuir à cause de la guerre
Some
civile.
had been running for days, weeks,
Ils ont commencé à fuir
They
pour
were
des
all
jours et des
dehydrated.
jours.
sick, hungry. The women handed me their dead children. They thought maybe I was a doctor or something.
Les enfants croyaient que j'étais docteur ou quoi que ce soit.
Dead children back to life. I thought, what in the heck is going on here?
Comment je pouvais faire pour remettre la vie aux enfants? Qu'est-ce qui n'allait pas là-bas?
So for 3 or 4 days, this is
Trois,
what I
quatre
saw. I saw
jours,
a lot of death. And I thought, you
les
know
enfants
what?
pouvaient
We
mourir.
do a lot of things in the Congress, and sometimes a lot of things we do are not worth much.
Des fois, des choses qu'on fait dans les congrès, ça n'a pas peut-être beaucoup de valeur.
Congress, I'm going to travel. I'm going to try to legislate, try to pass some legislation.
Pour faire passer une loi, la législation et
So this is
consort.
what I've been doing since 1983.
J'ai commencé à faire ça depuis
I've traveled to
1983.
130 nations and have been involved with
Plus de
human
30 pays.
rights and hunger and those kind of programs, and I love it. I feel like I am at least trying to
Je pense que j'essaye un peu
show a sermon rather than speak a sermon.
que de parler, mais de faire comprendre aux gens les choses. Je vais parler,
Mostly about
je
the children in the DRC.
vais parler à propos des enfants au Congo démocratique.
And the reason being is that they ought to be the primary beneficiaries
Ils doivent,
of
la
peace
raison est qu'ils
accords.
doivent être les
in my
bénéficiaires principaux.
To secure the peace, it is critical that the sources which drive the
Pour
conflict are
sécuriser la
addressed.
paix, il faut que cette sécurité,
And we all know that the ambitions to extract cobalt
nous
and other
sommes
crucial minerals
impatients
from the
d'aller prendre
DRC
des
have been
minéraux
driving
cruciaux
much
et
of the
d'extraire le
violence.
cobalt.
And the second reason I'm here on behalf
la-
of many friends.
La deuxième raison, c'est la raison,
Africa New Day
j'ai
and
beaucoup d'amis
12 other non-profit
et puis
organizations
12
that work
autres,
in the DRC.
12 autres
They are
organisations
seeking
et
to
puis
free
African
these
New Day.
children. They are seeking to provide
Ils
education
sont là
and
pour
therapy
aider
and
les
offer
enfants,
food,
l'éducation aux enfants, la nourriture aux enfants.
administer healthcare,
Et puis
find
donner la santé,
employment
et
alternatives for their future.
la santé pour les bien-être des enfants et leur futur.
Third,
La
I'm here
troisième
on
des choses,
behalf
je
of
suis
leaders
ici.
from business,
Je suis ici dans
finance,
les
and
niveaux
several
des
members of other
business.
parliaments
C'est aussi un truc de
will
parlement.
look to this committee
Nous allons chercher à ces
partnership in
comités
creating
d'avoir
an
un
international
partenariat
framework that can
pour
support
construire
clean
une
supply
structure
chains
qui va
of
nous
critical
aider,
minerals
qui va nous aider pour avoir
that
des
provide
minéraux
economic
critiques,
prosperity and
pour
and
la
a stronger
prospérité, l'économie
governance
et
for the
puis
people of
un
the
gouvernement
Democratic Republic of
fort
the Congo.
pour le Congo.
You know, it's no secret,
Il n'y a pas de secret.
and it's been known for more than 15 years
Et
that
c'est
children are
connu
being exploited
Plus de 15 ans que
and
les enfants sont
trafficked
exploités au
in
Congo
the
et
mining
trafiqués
of cobalt
dans les mines
in
de
the
cobalt
Congo.
dans le Congo.
And hundreds of investigative journalists have
Les
documented the
journalistes ont
problem in print
investigué, ils ont parlé de ça.
Dozens of reports have been
Beaucoup,
written
beaucoup,
by the
beaucoup, des
UN,
milliers de rapports.
Amnesty International,
Les Amnesty International,
US and international universities,
universities
and they
et
all
tout ça,
detailed
tous,
the links
ils ont dit au lien
between the corrupt mining practices,
pour dire la pratique de
co-mingling
corruption
of
dans
raw
les mines,
materials, the processing of all far away from any transparent system for accountability.
le processus il n'y a
And
pas
we
la
believe
transparence, il n'y a
that
pas
at least
d'accountability.
40,000 children,
Les enfants,
possibly up to 200,000 children under the age of 12,
les enfants moins de
are
12 ans,
working
plus de
in the
200
mining
000 sont
sector
de
of
travail dans les
DRC.
secteurs miniers
earning less than $2
et
a day.
gagnant $2 par
Well
jour.
over a decade of well-documented
Ça, c'est
exploitation.
plus de
This
10 ans
committee-
de documentation.
This committee must recognize that the batteries made in China,
Et
from the minerals
ce
extracted
comité, ou
from
bien
the
ce comité
DRC,
doit reconnaître que les batteries qui ont
I
été
call them
faites
blood batteries.
en Chine, les minéraux, ça vient du
our
Congo
cell
démocratique.
phones,
Les téléphones
electric vehicles,
euh,
subsidized by the labor of exploited
qui ont
people,
été
especially
exploités par
children.
les enfants de moins de 12 ans.
And we must recognize
Nous devons reconnaître
there is a tremendous cost to human life in order for us to
qu'il y a
get cheap
vraiment
mobile
la vie
phones.
des humains en péril pour avoir tout ce que nous voulons là.
Blood. These kids, you know, they're working
Ces
7
enfants,
days a week,
ils travaillent 7 jours par semaine,
working 12 hours
12
a
heures
day,
par jour.
and they're working in conditions
Ils
that
travaillent dans des conditions.
I've even heard that some of them are even 3 years old. A lot of them 6, 7, and 8 years old. Work without shoes. They have
Ils travaillent sans
safety
chaussures,
conditions.
sans habits, sans des éléments appropriés pour
terrible
travailler dans de terribles conditions.
30 years ago,
30 ans passés,
Mr. Chairman, you and I
Chris
travel
Smith,
together,
vous et moi, nous avons voyagé vers l'Est,
go to different countries.
dans
and,
beaucoup de
I
pays.
remember that in Sierra Leone, we
Nous avons été au Sierra Leone.
came face to face with conflict diamonds.
On
what
a
we-
vu le
we
problème
call
des
them
gens
blood
en face
diamonds.
pour les conflits des diamants.
And they were what they were doing to children.
Ce qu'on faisait aux enfants
Sierra Leone
au
and
Sierra Leone,
Angola, and even in the Congo.
même au Congo.
But I remember in Sierra Leone, Frank Wolf and I,
Je me rappelle qu'au Sierra Leone,
former Congressman Frank Wolf and I, we traveled to
le sénateur Frankfurt,
Sierra Leone. We
nous
went to
sommes
this
partis à
refugee
Sierra
camp,
Leone.
and all the children in the refugee camp had
Tous les enfants
something
et dans
missing.
les camps des réfugiés,
Their hand was cut off, their arm was cut off,
les bras étaient
ear was cut
coupés
off, their nose was cut off. I said, "What is this?"
et il y avait une atrocité terrible.
It was because of blood diamonds.
On dit ça, c'est le sang, le diamant de sang.
These terrorist groups would come into these different places similar to what's going on in the Congo.
Qui
They
sont
would
vraiment au courant de
terrorize
ce qui se passe au Congo,
neighborhoods and small villages,
dans des petits
and
villages.
they would seize these diamonds. They would not be registered in the country. These diamonds would find their ways into Beers, Tiffany's, Cartiers, and Americans bought 60% of these blood diamonds.
Tous ces diamants-là, 60% les
So
Américains en
we
achetaient.
passed some legislation. You were part of that
Et
legislation.
nous avons passé la législation.
It turned into the Kimberley process.
On n'est pas dans le Kimberley process.
Now, instead of people buying blood diamonds, only 60% of the Americans bought the blood diamonds. It's now down to 1%.
Il y avait 60%
And it was
des Américains
because
qui ont
of
acheté
committees like this.
les diamants de sang. Maintenant, c'est descendu jusqu'à 1% à cause de la législation qu'on a pu mettre.
So Eventually, this led to the Kimberley process,
Maintenant,
which
c'est
has
arrivé au
brought
processus de
greater
Kimberley,
transparency to the
où il y a la
supply chain.
transparence.
And it kept pressures on the suppliers to ensure fair
J'ai
practices and
toujours
protect
forcé
the U.S.
sur
consumers from supporting
la
terrorism.
façon de la
The
traçabilité.
mining of cobalt
Maintenant, pour les cobalt
and other critical
et
minerals
d'autres
in the
minerais
DRC
critiques dans
are
le Congo,
not clean.
ce n'est pas propre.
And the vast majority of the companies who profit from the
Toutes
products
ces compagnies qui
made
profitent
with
de
these
ça,
minerals,
avec ces
they
minéraux,
know,
ils savent
that the
savent.
system
que le système,
is fueled by exploited labor.
avec l'exploitation des
DRC
travaux
has
forcés,
over $24 trillion
le Congo
worth of mineral
a plus
resources.
de 24
It's not a
trillions.
million, it's not a
Ce
billion,
n'est pas un
it's
million, c'est pas un
$24
milliard,
trillion
c'est 24
worth of
trillions
mineral
de dollars
resources which
avec
have
les
yet to
minéraux
be
des
tapped,
ressources au Congo démocratique.
which, if developed,
Si ça se
could
développe,
unleash the most amazing economic development to the families and
ça
tribes
sera une économie
government of the
développée
DRC.
pour l'économie, les enfants du Congo
However,
et
for
les
too
peuples du Congo.
long,
Mais ça fait
local
très
officials
longtemps.
have colluded with corrupt foreign
Les,
businesses
les,
who
les, les,
extract
les,
these
les gouvernements
minerals,
locaux ont été
which
corrompus
exploit labor to enrich themselves,
et ils se sont enrichis
and they
eux-mêmes pour
deceive
très longtemps.
us, American consumers,
Et-
Western nations.
Uh-huh.
And sadly, instead of profiting from its wealth, the people of the DRC, they continue to live in deep
Le
poverty.
peuple du Congo démocratique souffre,
70%,
ils vivent dans une
73%
souffrance terrible,
Of the
73%.
109 million people living below the
Il y a
international
des gens
poverty
qui
line.
vivent en dessous de la ligne de pauvreté dans
I
le
want
monde
to
entier.
thank you,
Mais je vous dis
Mr.
merci à
Chairman
vous
and Representative Jacobs and members of the
pour
committee,
Sarah Jacobs et les membres de ce
considering
comité.
how to improve the situation. And certainly a political settlement is required.
Mhm.
And further, the committee should considering the following actions, and a lot of this
Et
is in
puis
the
ce comité
legislation
doit
that
commencer à
you,
suivre les actions qui
introduced,
doivent accompagner.
Chairman Smith. Enforce through regulations a transparency
Ils
requirement
doivent
for
forcer
cobalt and
quelques
other
régulations
critical
pour qu'il y ait une
minerals that enter the
transparence
United States.
dans ce qui se passe dans ces minéraux.
Work with other governments to enact regulations so
Travaillons
that
avec
there
d'autres
is a
gouvernements pour
coordinated transparency
activer
mechanism
la transparence
for the critical mineral supply chains
pour
so that
les chaînes
regulation reaches beyond
les
just our
chaînes
markets, but all
d'approvisionnement de ces
markets.
minéraux. Il faut qu'il y ait une transparence
Convene
totale.
DRC and industry leaders to devise strategies
Et puis avoir des
that
stratégies
empower and sustain
Et
economic growth
pour qu'il y
and
ait
stability for the long-term
pour
viability
une
of
économie stable
a
pour un long
secure and
temps.
healthy future.
Et puis pour que ce soit un futur
And
meilleur.
require U.S. technology companies to adhere to clean supply chains
On
and
doit
enforce
amener
it
les compagnies
vigorously.
technologiques américaines pour venir
We also
et
need to
clarifier
educate
cela et aider à établir, à tracer
consumers.
une
I can
transparence.
talk more about that.
Et nous parlerons encore
Thank
beaucoup
you,
plus
Mr.
là-dessus.
Chairman.
Merci.
Ambassador Hall, thank you so very much for that leadership that spans so many decades. It's been incredible.
Voilà, donc
I'd
vous
like to
voyez
now
que
yield
jusqu'à
to
présent,
Mr.
les
Lima.
deux personnes insistent sur la population
Chairman,
congolaise, sur le peuple
ranking
congolais.
members, and members of the
Les
subcommittee,
deals ici que vous
thank you for
voyez,
this
moi, je crois que c'était
opportunity
une chance pour
to
le
address the
Congo.
conflict in the Eastern DRC
Ça
and the
sera
path
une très
forward
bonne
for the
chose
Washington
pour nous. Ça, je peux
Accords.
vous le dire.
My core argument is quite simple.
Ça, c'est-
The Washington
il s'appelle
process and its
Christian
agreements
Giraud
are
de
significant
Lima.
diplomatic achievement, but the long-term success will depend on linking them to a broader political strategy that confront the internal
La stratégie
drivers of
politique
instability in the DRC.
Pour la stabilité des
First
RDC.
point, I would like
Premier
to
point.
salute here the value of the Washington process.
Je suis content
It has
pour la
once
valeur de
again
l'accord de
clarified
Washington.
Rwanda's role in supporting the M23
Le rôle
rebellion,
des Rwandais
a fact now
supporter les M23.
publicly acknowledged by its own ambassador here in
Ils
the
ont
US,
reconnu,
though
leur
it was
propre
framed
ambassadeur a
as
reconnu
security
cela.
collaboration.
Pour la collaboration.
Furthermore, its innovative regional economic integration framework, the REEF, incentivizes peace, linking stability
La
and
paix
shared,
qui est en train d'encourager
shared
la
regional
stabilité
development.
autour des-
However,
des-
a key
des relations régionales.
vulnerability is the non-inclusion of other regional countries in that framework, here being Uganda and Burundi,
Il dit
which are
Burundi,
still
l'Ouganda ne sont
intervening
pas
in the
impliqués dans ce
DRC for
framework-là
both
de
security
l'intégration
and
régionale.
economic purposes. Finally, the pressure that from this administration to have the M23 withdraw from Uvira early this year is a testament of the political leverage the U.S. has had over the warring parties in this crisis. My second point, we must recognize the interconnection between different peace processes. The Washington processes address the bilateral crisis between DRC and Rwanda. At the same time, the Doha process has opened direct talks between the Congolese government and the M23. That is very important. It recognizes the existence of an internal dynamic of the Congolese conflict. However, the progress remains quite slow in the Doha process. Why? Because it depends on the dynamic on the Washington process. Kinshasa still hopes external pressure on Rwanda will change the military dynamic on the ground. At the same time, the M23 still calculates its military leverage based on the pressure that Washington will put on Rwanda to sustain the crisis on the ground. Meanwhile, the African Union is working to find a way to implement the various resolutions coming from Doha and Washington process. This fragmentation creates an unclear accountability from different parties, a lack of measurable milestone, and an intended marginalization of the AU, the organization which is very much best positioned to address the conflict on the ground because the conflict is happening in Africa. Third, I'd like to ask to broaden our focus in this conflict. While Rwanda's interference in Eastern DRC is real and must be stopped, there's no debate about that. However, Rwanda is not the primary drivers of Congo instability. Stopping Rwanda alone does not solve the issue of proliferation of armed groups in the DRC, being like the ADF. The ADF has been killing hundreds of people almost on a weekly basis, but almost unreported, or having the Codeco, the Red Tabara, or the Wazalendo, the Mobondo, at the outskirts of Kinshasa. It will not solve the profound governance failure, corruptions, and weak institutions which allow these groups to regenerate and this conflict to re-emerge after a few years. For more than 20 years, these weaknesses have been the real drivers of instability in the country. Until they are addressed properly, peace agreement will remain fragile. The instability in Eastern DRC has for years evolved beyond the conflict mineral paradigm. Today, it's driven by local disputes, struggle over customary authority, community self-defense, and deep governance failures. Resources often finance violence, but they are not its main causes. So the real question here is not only how to end this crisis, but how to prevent the next one to happen. Therefore, for the Washington Accord to have a lasting impact, the U.S. policymakers must take the decisive next step. The U.S. should publicly and decisively support an African Union-led facilitated Congolese dialogue. The goal here is not to engage the U.S. in an endless state-building process in the DRC. This is not the U.S. mission, but to use its considerable political leverage to champion a continental process that addresses the foundational crisis of governance, institution building, and national reconciliation in the DRC. This must include two non-negotiable elements: the meaningful inclusion of Congolese civil society. Chairman Smith have said that, and Rep. Jacobs also has mentioned that, particularly those coming from structural institutions like the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church to ensure societal buy-in into those processes. Second, a component of justice and accountability, which has been missing in every agreement that's been signed here in Washington. Peace without justice risks being seen as an elite deal, fueling resentment and future cycle of violence. In conclusion, the Washington Accord and the RIF provides a crucial foundation. But if we address only the M23 and cross-border issues with Rwanda, we will miss the deeper disease. The strategic partnership agreement and the RIF will not survive if Congo internal fragility continues to undermine them. Partnership must be anchored in institutional and accountability, not in personalities or short-term politics. Finally, lasting stability requires rebuilding the Congolese state itself. By anchoring the Washington process within a supported AU-led comprehensive strategy, the U.S. can ensure its own long-term interest, bolster strategic partnership with the DRC, and help achieve a peace that is both just and durable. Thank you.
OK. Bon, lui a plus parlé que le problème, il faut l'Union africaine, il faut les prêtres catholiques et puis les protestants. Il pense que le problème n'est pas seulement sortir le Rwandais ou le
on the cobalt issue, the hope is that if this agreement were to truly bear the fruit that we all hope and pray that it will. The
Mais
need
lui a
to
écarté les États-Unis
pass
pour laisser l'Union
legislation
africaine, mais
like
ce qui n'est
mine,
pas
which
vrai
I've
parce qu'il
been
n'a pas
pushing now
compris
for
que les
several
États-Unis
years,
ont l'intérêt au Congo, ne vont pas laisser l'Union
becomes
africaine. C'est pourquoi je dis
you know,
son point de
if
vue
the
qu'elle
cobalt
reste
stays
plutôt,
in
mais,
and the other minerals,
c'est sa
coltrane and
façon
all
de
the
parler
others
selon lui, mais bon, je sais que c'est
inside
un
of
Rwandais, c'est comme ça qu'il doit
DR
parler.
Congo or are processed by a nearby friendly country that is not a human rights abuser like the Chinese nation, then we will have achieved much. And my hope is, and I said this to President Tshisekedi when he met with a number of us last week, that we want the wealth
Nous voulons que
to
la
stay
richesse,
inside of DR
que ça reste au
Congo
Congo d'abord,
so that the people
pour que les gens
will
du Congo,
benefit first
que
and
les
foremost. And that
peuples
means the
congolais
children, that
bénéficient
means
d'abord.
the families.
Les
I mean,
familles.
the wealth is so extraordinary.
Il y a, et c'est
And
une richesse
unfortunately,
extraordinaire au Congo,
the people who want
mais
to
il faut d'abord que ça aide le
steal
peuple
it
congolais premièrement.
by force and by deception are ever present. So the hope is that that will happen.
Je
My
crois que c'est ça
bill
qui va
would
arriver.
provide a rebuttable presumption that anything coming from China,
Tout ce qui vient de la Chine,
cobalt, is inadmissible to the U.S.
Ouais, ouais, ce
We
n'est pas
know
ça.
that the EV fleet that the Chinese is producing, which is now growing in numbers
Pour les
every single
batteries que
day,
la Chine est en
for
train de
instance, in
produire,
the
les
EU, is a huge moneymaker for Xi Jinping.
Ouais, c'est beaucoup d'argent
So
pour
he
le
wants
président chinois,
that
Jinping.
cobalt in the worst way. President Tshisekedi made it clear that he's trying to get a better deal,
Le
but I
président
do believe
Tshisekedi a dit
that
clairement
so
qu'il y
long
aura
as China,
un deal
which
meilleur.
has no such thing as a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act like we do, is you can count on them engaging in this in a very corrupt and misleading way.
Donc,
And the fact of the matter is that the people of Congo are suffering because of it. So
il dit que
I hope we
Tshisekedi
can
a
get our
promis
bill
qu'il va
passed.
faire
I
tout
hope
pour le
that
problème de
the
corruption
accord
avec ce que les Chinois font
eclipses
consort.
the reason
Et
to
nous
do it.
croyons que ça va
But you're
marcher.
right,
C'est
and we
obligé
need,
de
and you might
brièvement,
want to
quoi.
speak to this, just as you did with the blood diamonds, make
Nous parlons à notre
American
esprit que c'est
consumers
fait avec les
especially
blood diamonds,
aware.
les-
And when you
les-
buy
les
it,
pots.
all to them,
Et ça
all the
les
power
irrite
to
beaucoup
them.
quand ils voient
But
toutes
it's
ces
got to be
productions-là.
with a supply chain that is not tainted in a way
Ils
that
vont
this one is
vérifier la
today.
ligne
And your number you just gave us of
la
what,
ligne qui produit, la ligne de
200,000
production
kids
doit
being
être
hurt by the
sécurisée.
mining. I mean, that is just off the charts. Those kids aren't going to school. They're not getting good
Il y a des
nutrition.
enfants qui ne vont pas à l'école,
And
il y a
above
pas de
all, they're being
nutrition ou bien
exploited
des
by,
mauvaises conditions pour
by
aller à
these
l'école.
people. So, that's something you might want to speak to in terms of making American consumers aware, other consumers as well.
Il
We've
faut
reached
peut-être
out to the
parler pour les
Europeans, and
Américains
they're looking
comprennent
at
ceux-là qui
legislation
mangent, qui prennent,
at
qui
the House of
consomment,
Commons,
les
and you've
histoires
helped
qui
to make that
viennent, les
happen,
enfants qui sont
to do
utilisés
a
dans les
bill
travaux
similar to
forcés.
ours. Hopefully we share best practices. Let cobalt come out of DRC, but let it be processed in a way that is
Il faut que ça soit
absolutely above
procédé
board.
et
Secondly, I just want to
d'une
ask about the
correcte façon.
MONUSCO.
La
The
MONUSCO.
peacekeeping by that organization has been flawed over the decades, but it's still needed. I visited
La
them
MONUSCO qui est encore
when
en
under
prison au
Ambassador
Congo, mais qui
Swing.
a fait beaucoup de
Little
temps
kids
là-bas,
were
mais
being exploited, forced into prostitution, but especially being exploited, 12, 13-year-olds, by the peacekeepers.
dans les gens qui sont dans la
So I had
MONUSCO,
4
ils sont en
hearings. I
train
went to
d'utiliser la
Goma,
prostitution des
visited
enfants
with
de
them,
12-13
raised
ans.
the issue profoundly and strongly in every other way
lui pense
I
que
could
c'est
think
pas
of it. And to his credit, Kofi Annan did a zero tolerance policy for the Blue Helmets. 6 months
Comme,
later, I had
Kofi
another
a
hearing, and
fait,
I said it's
zéro
zero
tolérance pour
compliance
les-
with the
les
zero
sangs des
tolerance
diamants.
policy. So we got to make sure that the peacekeepers,
Nous voulons être sûrs
one, are very well vetted so that they're not engaging
les gens de
in sexual
MONUSCO
predatory
ne doivent pas
activity,
s'engager dans
especially
des
against children, but
prédateurs
all
sexuels au
people,
Congo démocratique.
all women especially.
Et surtout les
But
femmes.
also that they have they've been reauthorized. It was reauthorized, as we all know, in
On a réautorisé.
December. The troop strength is really significant. But I do remind myself, and MONUSCO has it on their fact sheets, 304 of their soldiers have died in personnel. They also
il y a
have
des
police.
militaires qui
So
sont
it's not
aussi morts.
without risk, but
Ce
the
n'est pas
rules of
qu'ils ne sont pas
engagement
au
have to be
risque, mais
such,
les-
in my
les-
opinion,
les-
that they
les
can
pratiques
help
sexuelles et des prédateurs, là,
truly
c'est pas bon.
make the peace.
Il faut mettre vraiment la paix.
Where
Quand on
necessary,
parle de
and
paix, il faut la
so
paix.
that comes down to leadership. I'm sorry to say that the South African nation has pulled its peacekeepers
l'Afrique du Sud a
out.
repris ses
I think that
militaires.
was a very sad and tragic
C'est
chain of
tragique
events that has
qu'ils aient
happened
repris
here by
leurs
the
militaires.
president of South Africa. They had about 700 plus peacekeepers out of the 12,000
Sur,
approximately. So it's a loss.
12 000,
But
ils avaient
with
plus
the
de
right
700.
kind of direction, and I mean this, the right kind of leadership, the peacekeepers can really make a difference.
En quoi
We've seen it in other places. Tony, you and I have seen it
amené la différence.
in Sudan. We saw it in South Sudan, where the peacekeepers had a less than robust rules of engagement, and things happened right under their noses. That's as some openings, but if you could, I just remind everybody that 70% of the world's cobalt reserves come from the DRC, and some say the number is higher. So again, it can produce great wealth. That all accrue to the people of the DRC. And again, on Rwanda, you know, we have called, and if you look at the reauthorization of the peacekeeping, you know, they really call on Rwanda to do more with their forces, to step back and stop aiding and abetting groups like M23. It's just got to stop. I mean, to use rape as a weapon, you mentioned Ethiopia, and I worked with you on that. You took the lead on that, Tony, Ambassador Hall, years ago. But I remember when we realized that Mengistu was using food as a weapon. You know, one of the worst and most well-documented atrocities, food was used as a weapon to attract people, then they would kill them.
Donc, avoir les gens, amener la nourriture,
how many
puis
people
pour
died in Ethiopia? It
les
was
attraper puis les
horrific.
tuer.
And so thank you for your leadership on
Merci
that.
pour ce que tu as parlé
we can
aussi.
start with that. You're educating the American consumer.
Well, you said a lot of amazing things, Mr. Chairman.
Ah, eux, ils parlent trop lentement et je n'entends rien. Je vous dis, je n'entends rien du tout.
Education is the most powerful tool to change the
Un
world.
instant, je vais voir si je peux encore mettre ça à l'oreille.
One is we need to pass your legislation. And I think it's important to have penalties in there that people that deal in cobalt, where there's child labor, to have stiff penalties and prison. If you're caught dealing in this issue, and this is a law passed by the United States, by you and your committee, that you deal with them harshly. The other thing that
Il
I
parle
think
pour
is
les gens qui
important,
utilisent les
it's
enfants mineurs
important
dans les
for
mines, il faut une
our
punition
people
d'aller en prison.
in America and other nations that we're working with, especially in Great Britain and European
D'autres pays
nations,
qu'on
that
travaille
if
avec, comme l'Angleterre et les pays européens,
our consumers need to know that their iPhones,
nos consommateurs doivent savoir que nos téléphones,
they're rechargeable,
qui sont
electric cars,
rechargeables, tout
they're
ça,
made of
les
cobalt.
voitures et consorts, ça vient du cobalt.
As you said, 70 to 80% of this is
Donc 70 à 80%, ça vient du cobalt congolais, qui vient de la Chine.
it's made, a good portion of it is made with child labor.
Mais ça a été fait avec le travail de
People
l'enfant,
need to
le
start
travail
ask the
forcé.
question. If this iPhone is made with cobalt,
Tous ces téléphones
and
qui
it's
sont faits avec
related
le
to child
cobalt,
labor,
et puis
I'm not
dû
gonna
au
buy it.
travail forcé des enfants, travaux forcés.
And we did that with blood diamonds.
Si on a fait ça avec les sangs, du diamant de sang,
Sold a lot of women on the idea that diamonds are a girl's best friend. Matter of fact, they sold
comme
my
on
wife
disait
on
aux
it.
femmes que non, les diamants étaient votre meilleur ami.
I had a heck of a time convincing my wife
J'étais
that
en train de
diamonds are not a
convaincre-
girl's best friend when
en
it
train
comes
de
to blood
convaincre ma
diamonds.
femme que les diamants n'étaient pas
The fact is that-
meilleurs amis.
When we were able to educate
Quand on a éduqué
women, when they went into jewelry
les
stores
femmes,
and
quand
went
ils
into
vont
Cartier, and
dans
went
les
into
magasins, dans les stores pour acheter,
the beer stores and jewelry
quand nous leur
stores,
avons dit que les diamants, c'est les
are
diamants de
these
sang,
diamonds, are they blood diamonds? Are they from countries like Sierra Leone,
ça vient des pays
Congo,
comme,
and these kind of
comme Sierra Leone.
these terrorists are using?
C'est ce que les terroristes utilisent.
And when we got women to say that,
Nous avons eu des femmes qui
they
disaient ça.
started to ask the jewelry stores. This was translated back to the Congo, Sierra Leone.
Et puis on a commencé à parler de ça au Sierra Leone et partout dans le monde.
Stopped blood diamonds, and the Kimberley process
Et
was
ça a arrêté dans
developed.
les processus de Kimberley, les problèmes des diamants de sang.
Blood diamonds, where we bought 60%, or America bought 60%
Nous, on
of
avait
the blood
60%
diamonds, now down
des
to
diamants de
1%.
sang, les Américains.
That's the same thing we have to do with coal.
C'est ce qu'on doit aussi faire avec le cobalt congolais.
We need to pass the strong laws
Il faut qu'on passe une loi forte
that are in your bills, but we also need to educate our
et puis nous avons aussi besoin
They
d'éduquer
need
aussi
to
les gens.
ask the question. This iPhone,
Que tous ces
this
téléphones,
battery
leurs batteries,
is made with cobalt,
ça a été fait avec le cobalt.
and a good portion of it it's developed and made through child labor. Then
Et puis
I'm
ça a
not gonna
été
buy
fait
it.
au développement
know what?
des travaux forcés des enfants dans les
That'll
mines.
stop it
Je
in a
crois
minute.
que ça va stopper
But
immédiatement.
It took us It took us 5 years.
Nous, ça nous avait pris
to pass
5
that
ans
Blood Diamond Bill.
pour,
Because it took a
pour
long
la
time
loi
to
des
educate consumers, and that's what- I
les
think
diamants de
that's what
sang.
we're gonna have to do.
Je pense que c'est ce que nous devons faire sur le
Our
cobalt
consumers
congolais.
have to be educated.
Thank you, and thank you all again.
Elle parle quand même voix forte.
So,
Merci.
you know, I think it's clear we have a long way to go before peace is actually realized in Eastern Congo,
On a
and
un
neither
chemin à
DRC nor
faire
Rwanda
pour
has
qu'il y ait la
upheld
paix au
its
Congo
commitments that they agreed to. And, you know, as I said, we are still waiting on tough actions promised by the Trump administration 2 months ago.
On attend,
So,
les
Mr.
actions du
Nima,
gouvernement
what is
Trump
your assessment of the
depuis 2 mois.
U.S.-led peace process so far, and what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of the current peace processes?
Tu peux nous dire les
Thank you.
parties forts et les
As I
parties
said
faibles
earlier in my
de
statement, the
ces
peace process has
processus.
created a framework for accountability for all the parties involved in this process so far. So far, it's also established responsibility of Rwanda in that process, which they've acknowledged. But the peace process is missing in a sense where it's not connected to a broader issue of peace and stability in the country. And I think it's very important for that peace to succeed is to be focused on the internal issue of the DRC beyond the simple fact of geopolitical tension and geopolitical framework. And I do believe that the geopolitical framework of the peace process may undermine the incentive for different stakeholders on how they approach the United States and the incentive to engage in various different processes that leads to peace and stability in the DRC. So I do believe that it's very important to reframe the peace process and to put it in a broader context with a goal of peace and stability in the DRC and try to move away from the geopolitical framing of the whole process.
Thank you. And if you had some specific recommendations for the administration on how to get the process back on track, you know, not just to get the process back on track, but to like achieve that enduring peace and stability in DRC, what would they be?
Quelle sera ta recommandation?
My few recommendations I've made in my written statement would be, first of all, to include civil society. Both of you have agreed on that process because they are the key elements to societal buy-in in that process, because without them we do have a very fragile peace process. But the other one, and as I said in my oral statement, is the need of a Congolese political dialogue. That is a must that we have to address, because we cannot look into that crisis from an external point of view and believing that external actors are the key element in that crisis. The key element in this crisis are internal to the DRC. If they are not addressed, the next 3 years we're going to find ourselves here having to address why Uganda is still feeling armed deals in the eastern DRC, why Burundi, a change of leadership has led Burundi to become the enemy of the DRC. And if we do not address those empirical issues, the fundamental issues on the problem, we won't be able to address the issue. So I think that the U.S. administration supporting publicly and openly an African Union-led, because it's what's already on the way for those Congolese dialogue will be important. Given the leverage the United States has over Kinshasa today, that's going to be a strong signal for having Kinshasa to agree in those processes.
Thank you. And Mr. Tannen, Ambassador Hall, the president has promised swift punitive actions on the spoilers to peace, including Rwanda. What specific punitive measures, sanctions on individuals, export restrictions on minerals from N23 controlled areas, suspension of military cooperation, or other tools should the administration deploy immediately to demonstrate that American warnings are serious? And what message does our inaction send to the Congolese people?
Quel est le message pour le peuple congolais?
I think one of the problems with the Washington Accords,
Le papa parle trop lentement.
and the part that especially the parts that I've read, it doesn't say anything about child labor. It doesn't say anything about child soldiers.
Il a dit que dans l'accord de Washington, là où ils ont oublié, c'est les travaux forcés des enfants et puis les enfants soldats. Ça a été mis hors de l'accord de Washington qu'il faut ajouter. Et puis les problèmes familiales. C'est ce que je veux dire, les grands problèmes, c'est ça.
I think for the administration, when it comes to the sanctions that the State Department has previously mentioned wanting to enforce, I believe the targeting of organizations that are closely tied
Lui dit
to the
qu'il faut aller après les organisations qui sont après les...
Crystal Ventures and the Rwanda investment groups, both holding companies which are closely tied up to state and military financial investors, will force the Rwandan government to
Il dit que ça va
continue
forcer
to
le gouvernement
comply,
rwandais,
and with their acknowledgement of their alignment with M23,
comme ils ont reconnu
by
qu'ils
that
sont avec les
action,
M23,
enforce continued M23 withdrawal.
donc ça va aider à M23
Thank
de
you.
retirer. Il faut
And
sanctionner
then
les
my
compagnies
last
qui sont
question
liées
is
avec le
back to you,
Rwanda.
Mr. Nima. As you know,
rentre
in
chez
addition to
Nima.
the Washington Accords, the U.S. signed the U.S.
Avec
DRC
l'accord de
bilateral
Washington,
strategic
avec
partnership
le
agreement,
partnership de-
which is
des
meant to,
États-Unis et le Congo.
ensure access to critical minerals and deepen economic cooperation. I know you have a lot of expertise in DRC's mining sector. What have been the main barriers to Western investment in DRC's industrial mining operations?
Quel est le problème
And what does the
pour,
U.S.-DRC
pour,
strategic
les
partnership
minéraux
agreement
avec,
do,
les-
if anything, to address these?
avec les minéraux du Congo, avec les
The main
Western.
barrier when it comes to foreign investment in the mining sector in the DRC, especially when it comes to copper and cobalt, has been simply the bad governance in the mining sectors.
Il dit que c'est
The
la
lack of
mauvaise gouvernance
transparency,
dans
the
les
lack
secteurs
of
miniers du Congo,
clear
ce qui fait qu'il n'y a pas
management revenue system, and in political interference in the mining activities. Those have been the main barrier for investment, for any kind of foreign investment, being those who are present or those who even thinking of coming to the DRC. And the Washington Agreement, when it comes to bilateral agreement with the DRC, of course, it offers an opportunity for diversification for the DRC. But at the same time, it creates a particular cases for U.S. investment. As much as I understand the need for the United States to protect its investment in the DRC, I also do believe that it's important that the need to have a clear good governance in the mining sector
Lui dit que
applies
la
to
bonne
all, not
gouvernance
only
dans
to
les
U.S.
secteurs
companies,
miniers
because
va
the
aider
framework
avoir une bonne structure.
provision provides strong statement to protect U.S. investment in the
Pour
DRC. But I
protéger
think
les
those
investissements
provisions should be
États-Unis
applied to the whole
au-
mining sectors in a way that at the end, the mining sector for the DRC is open for business for all countries, not only specific countries.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Je vous expliquerai pourquoi
Mr.
Sarah
Olszewski.
Jacobs a posé ces questions-là. Mais maintenant, on rentre autour à tous les sénateurs qui sont là-bas. Vous allez maintenant entendre.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and to Ranking Member Jacobs for holding this very important hearing.
Merci à tout ça, à tout le monde.
We know that across the DRC, thousands of children are
Lui
being
parle des
exploited,
enfants au Congo
whether
qui
it's
sont
the child
exploités.
labor that's been covered extensively already in this hearing,
On
or
a parlé beaucoup
being
des
used as
enfants dans le travail
armed
très forcé.
fighters, pushed into dangerous work in mines and pushed into the military field. We've heard harrowing stories of boys abducted by armed groups,
Nous avons
being
appris
dragged
les
by their
enfants qui sont
villages,
adoptés
from their
par
villages,
les-
marched into the
les
forest,
armées,
put through weapons training,
entraînant les
forced to
enfants qui
participate
sont
in
des mères,
massacres, acting as human shields.
et puis utiliser l'homme comme étant
And while the
une
U.S. and the DRC have deepened cooperation through the Washington Accords and the Strategic Partnership Agreement, these frameworks include little to no enforceable guardrails on labor rights and child protection. So I wanted to add this extra layer in addition to the child safety abuses in the mines that we've discussed.
On a parlé aussi de la
For
protection des
example,
femmes.
the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, which I want to thank Chairman Smith for his continued leadership on,
Donc,
requires
la
the U.S.
protection
to
des
identify
filles, des enfants,
countries
soldats.
whose governments force or associated armed groups use child soldiers. It's now more than 6 months past the June 30th statutory deadline, and that list remains unpublished. So the State Department needs to do so, and to do so without any further delay. I want to ask first about these child soldiers to you, Ambassador Hall and Mr. Nima, and then I have a question, if it's okay, Mr. Chairman, my time is still okay, about children being used as weapons of war through violence. But the first question is, how can the U.S. best support efforts to prevent child recruitment and expand opportunities for affected children to reintegrate back into their communities around this issue of child soldiers, and what type of U.S. assistance programs have been most effective, and why is it in our interest to support them?
Les enfants pour quitter l'exploitation, en
Boy, I
fait.
tell you, that's
Papa
a
oyo.
tough issue.
Fala vanatana ndako.
Last time I was in the Congo, I met with child soldiers,
J'étais au Congo,
and
j'avais vu les enfants soldats.
several different groups of child soldiers.
J'ai vu beaucoup de groupes des enfants soldats.
They were in a particular refugee camp.
Ils étaient dans les réfugiés, dans les camps des
run
réfugiés.
by a faith-based group. And the thing that I remember with the child soldiers was that, wow, it was
Ce que je me
There
rappelle
were
d'enfants
about
soldats,
150 of them,
c'était plus de 150 enfants.
as I spoke to them,
Quand j'ai parlé avec eux,
listened to them, and asked questions of them, and they asked questions of me, their eyes were dead. I mean, it was like they'd been stunned and tortured and used.
il parle, il décrit l'enfant soldat et la façon qu'ils étaient là-bas et qu'on sort.
How hard it is to bring these kids back who have been part of killing and torturing.
Les tortures que les enfants ont pu subir, comment les enfants étaient stupéfaits.
This is one of the great tragedies of the Congo.
Ça, c'est une des stratégies au Congo,
Number of child soldiers.
les enfants soldats.
And it's a tough issue.
Et c'est un sujet difficile.
And to see a gleam of sunshine so hard, and after even 2 or 3 hours of just being with them and listening to them.
C'est très difficile, 2-3 heures de les écouter, être avec eux, c'est très difficile.
Sunshine. Tough issue. Tough kids. They've been absolutely crucified. But there are lots of wonderful nonprofit groups and faith groups in Congo that are working with them. Have been some successes. It's a tough road, very difficult.
Il paraît que c'est un chemin très difficile.
Certainly welcome the chance to get more details on some of those organizations. Perhaps we can find ways to support them further in that work.
Est-ce qu'il y a des organisations que tu peux énumérer pour qu'on sache comment s'y porter?
Organizations, what I would recommend is that is a tough ministry.
Yeah. And just one more issue, children being used as weapons of war through violence. UNICEF
Les enfants sont
has
utilisés à la
estimates
violence
that
comme,
children made up between 35 and 45%
35 à
of the nearly
45%.
10,000 cases of
Plus
rape
de-
and sexual
de 10 000
violence
des-
reported to
des-
protection
des-
actors in just January and February.
Violences sexuelles.
If you extrapolate that out,
Si tu
that
enlèves
means
tout ça.
during the most intense phases of last year's conflict in the eastern DRC, a
Pour
child
le-
was
le
raped
problème-
every half an hour.
Donc l'enfant a été violé chaque
So that's not
demi-heure.
one-off. That is a systemic crisis.
Ça, c'est un,
It's a weapon of war. It's a deliberate tactic of error. And so, in addition to
dans la guerre,
these child soldiers,
Tous les enfants
I guess I'm
soldats.
curious,
Je
just
suis
just to
curieux.
close my time, Mr. Chairman,
finir
if there
avec
are
mon temps.
concrete steps that we can take
ici il y a des,
in both of these
des
instances
étapes que nous devons
to
prendre
press for
concrètement
accountability
pour mettre la comptabilité
for these conversion of children into child
pour
soldiers, for these
transformer
systemic
ces
acts of
enfants
sexual
en
violence
enfants
against children.
soldats
How do we
et la
ensure
violence
those
contre les enfants.
perpetrators
Comment
can
on
face
fait de sorte que
consequences?
tous ces dangereux
And we can open it
personnes,
up
ces
to
dangereuses
anyone who wants to answer
personnes
there.
puissent être punies.
You've got legislation before you, and
Il faut la législation.
you've got wonderful civil society organizations.
Vous avez
that are
beaucoup
working
de
on it.
sociétés civiles.
I know that.
Je sais ça.
In the same visit that I made where I met with child soldiers, I also met with a lot of women that have
Dans la même visite,
part of
j'avais aussi rencontré les femmes qui ont été
sexual violence.
qui ont été
I've never
violemment
seen a
dans la
country
sexualité, violées violemment.
that had so many women that were sexually
J'ai
violent.
vu beaucoup de femmes qui
as I was,
étaient
and I've been to
sexuellement
130 nations.
utilisées
I've never seen a country that
violemment.
had so much sexual violence
Il y a
in
une
my
violence
life
sexuelle
than
accrue
in the Congo.
au Congo.
And there are amazing groups there that
Il y a
are working.
beaucoup de groupes là-bas, localement.
And, you know, with this Washington Accords peace agreement
Avec l'agrément de paix, l'accord de paix,
for more accountability
on
and
peut
more
utiliser la comptabilité, la
understanding of what's
redevabilité,
going
la
on in
restabilité,
Congo,
Oh.
not just for the minerals
pas seulement pour les minérales, les minéraux,
themselves, and really pushing and supporting the civil groups and the faith-based groups.
et puis encourager des groupes civils.
Safe to say we have our work cut out for us still. With that, I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Merci.
Chair recognizes Ms. Cherfilis McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our
Merci.
witnesses
Elle
here
est de
today.
Floride.
It seems like the common thread that we all want to ask questions about are the abuses to the children and also sexual violence
On va parler
against
des
women.
violences
Now, my question
sexuelles
is
et
for Mr.
l'abus des
Tan.
enfants.
They were putting together the Washington Accords.
Quand ils
Why
ont
was
mis-
it silent, or
comment
was
ils n'ont
it
pas mis
actually
ça dans
silent when it
l'accord
came
de
to the
Washington?
violence against women and
La
also
violence
children?
contre la femme et les enfants.
Thank you for the opportunity to address
Merci
that
pour
question.
l'opportunité.
I do not speak on behalf of the administration, but based on my
Je ne
research,
parle
the
pas
primary
dans
drivers
le cadre
behind
de
the Washington
l'administration.
Accords were getting both presidents to agree on both the security and economic standards.
Nous sommes en train de parler
And
sur la
my
sécurité au
understanding
Congo et
is
l'économie.
thereafter, as we're seeing with slow but incremental implementation of these accords, the engagement of civil society, such as both the Protestant and the Catholic Church, will be intertwined, not to undercut what has already happened, but
On ne
to
peut pas détruire ce qu'on a
state the
déjà fait,
importance
mais on doit
of
impliquer les,
holding leadership
les
accountable,
problèmes de la femme,
and
la
ultimately
violence, les
that
enfants,
the
et l'Église catholique.
enforcement is on the United States, but in order to see successes in this, both leaders are going to have to see this through on their ends.
And those two civil society organizations, will they be actually handling the situation of sexual violence
Est-ce que
and
ces
also
sociétés
violence
civiles-là,
against
est-ce qu'ils vont
children or the
s'appliquer
abuses of children?
pour protéger les enfants?
Based on my research, I would hope to see that these
Very
organizations
good
would be
question. Une
intertwined
très bonne
with their
question.
active
Est-ce que ces
organizations
les,
as Ambassador
les
Paul
catholiques et consorts, est-ce qu'ils vont
mentioned, such as
s'impliquer
UNICEF,
pour la
working
violence
on the
sexuelle de
ground
la
and
femme
close collaboration
et les
with
enfants dans les trucs?
My question is for Mr. Nima.
Madame Nima,
You
j'ai une
mentioned
question.
civil societies being integrated for us to have success.
Tu dis qu'il faut
Which
qu'on
ones would you
mette-
prioritize? Because there's so many different civil
Il y a
society
beaucoup
groups.
de
If you named
sociétés
5 or
civiles,
4,
beaucoup, il y en a.
what would be the top to the
Donnez-nous
bottom
s'il y en
that
a
we
5
should
ou 6.
actually
Dis-nous les deux qui
prioritize
seront au
immediately so
top,
we can have a
qu'on peut
positive
utiliser pour ce
results?
cas de choses.
The reality is today, civil society in the DRC is a very complex unit. It's going to be quite
très
difficult to
complexe. Ça sera
pinpoint because
difficile
if you start to
de
pinpoint
toucher
on them,
un.
some would say, why are you excluding the others? And
Si
some may
tu touches
even
un
threaten the
groupe
process because they're not
civil, ils vont
included.
dire que
If
tu
we're
as
not
des-
gonna, if we're not going to mention specific
Yes.
organizations, well, how would you classify it? Because as I mentioned, what the abuses we're seeing on children
L'abus sur les
and
enfants
women
et les femmes,
are astonishing.
Yes.
c'est
And
dépassant.
our priority is to deal with that.
Maintenant,
But
c'est
I
ça
want to
notre
know from
priorité
your
pour qu'on puisse résoudre le
perspective,
problème de la femme et de
what
l'enfant.
is the priority?
Quelles
Because
sont
we
la
may have
priorité?
one belief, and I want to know from you, actually,
J'aimerais
what would they
savoir
be?
que ça
Maybe
sera
1
qui?
through 5, so we
1 à
know the
5, qui sera en
categorizations.
top
Yes.
pour qu'on
I'll
sache.
mention at least two. I think those even representation, the represented met with Chairman Smith, is the SENCO and the SEC, both Catholic Church, faith-based organization. They have a
et
broader
SEC.
national
Je les mettrai
outreach.
au-dessus.
They have a wide range of programs
Ils ont beaucoup de
integrating
programmes
children, women
pour
in
aider
the
les enfants et la
activities.
femme.
So integrating them in the process allows you to have an access to a
Si vous
wide
les
range of
intégrez dans le système, ça va
established
vous aider.
network for many years. That's
Ça
going to
va
allow you
aider
to
dans
touch
beaucoup
those
d'années.
communities that are even under in war zones where they're still active, because the Catholic Church, despite
l'Église catholique,
having wars in Goma and Bukavu, are still working. They still have
ils sont
activities.
encore là-bas, ils ont
Same with the
des activités là-bas, Goma,
Protestant
Bukavu.
Church. So it's
Et
very
c'est
important those two
important
organizations,
que
based
nous
on their
puissions mettre les deux
outreach, to be able
organisations, la
to be
SENCO et
included.
les
They are the
catholiques.
only ones today with that level of
C'est
outreach
les seuls
on national level in the
aujourd'hui qui
DRC.
ont ces
So
niveaux-là
we're
à
seeing
faire ça.
violence against women increasing throughout the entire world.
Mais maintenant, nous
And
voyons
do
la
you
violence
believe that
contre
the
la femme.
Congolese government is interested or prioritizing
Est-ce que vous
any
pensez
kind
que
of
le gouvernement
resolution
congolais est
towards
aussi en train
stopping
de
that violence
réfléchir
or
pour
dealing with
stopper
that violence?
des traiter
Unfortunately, it's
cela?
going to be difficult to say that we are seeing that prioritization taking places. We see a lot of rhetoric, of course, governmental rhetoric in terms of like the actions are taken. But when you look into the numbers of violation against women, we see they are coming from both sides,
Okay.
both on the Congolese army side with the
violence,
FRDC,
il
with the
parle
Wazalendo,
que
who have
les
made for
femmes,
former
les Wazalendo
group that have been now aligned with
les
the
enfants.
Congolese government, also on the M23 side. So on the Congolese part side, we don't
Pour le
see,
Congo.
we see a lot of rhetoric, as I say, but in terms of actual actions in terms to address those issues, we still have to see much more than rhetoric.
So that's my concern, is that there's nobody who's really prioritizing it. And even right now, we don't have any women who are on the panel who can actually speak to the
Thank
violence that's
you.
going on with women. And we don't have anybody in their own voice to speak up on why women are being
We're gonna find
targeted
you a
in
woman.
this
I'm
manner.
gonna write to
And
you,
so
don't worry.
looking forward on how we can actually make sure that this accord is successful, we do have to support and acknowledge the role of women who are mothers to these children who are being abused. The compounded effect on families won't be resolved
Il
if we
parle, il
don't
faut qu'il
actually
soit
tend to
une
each
femme qui doit
person
aussi
in that
parler
family.
et
And so I
puis
wanted to
parler
bring
aussi.
that up. Another thing I wanted to talk about
Autre
are
chose?
inadvertent offenses. And maybe Hall or Mr. Tran can answer this. So we've been hearing that many Congolese have been applying for visas, and they meet all the requirements, and they're being denied. Is there a possibility, have we thought this through, that maybe we are offending the partners who we're trying to work with?
These are exactly the reason why you don't have women in this panel today, because there are organizations in this room who have tried to lobby to come to DC for advocacy, to have women from civil society, from those warring area that have been denied visa here. So the issue that you've mentioned, it's a very important issue today, where we cannot in one hand say we are helping the people from the DRC, at the same time not allowing them to have access to DC to plead their own cases.
Well, I think this is part of the cultural competency that us as Americans have to learn. We can't be trying to build a relationship but be offending the entire community at the same time. We have to be open and make sure that we are welcoming if we're forcing ourselves upon. And I think part of the buy-in that's lacking and why we're not seeing real change or real growth or in this piece is because it seems like there wasn't buy-in from the civil society. And I would hope that we can identify more ways that we can get buy-in. And I thank you so much, Representative Hall, for being here and all you've done, because what you bring to this is not just the idea that we need to work on this from an economic standpoint, but the compassion that is needed. And so thank you for all the work you've done and the compassion you've brought to this conversation, because I think as the United States, we lead not just the world, but we must lead with humanitarianism and also compassion. So thank you so much for doing that. And the last question I wanted to ask was the sensitivity to the standards. Do you believe, or what would you recommend in this climate that we're in right now? We already talked about several situations going on. What do you think we can add to get greater buy-in when it comes to the Washington Accord, so we can see tangible success and tangible results? That's for anybody.
I do believe that one of the main points would be for Washington to send a clear message that the Washington Accord is not a geopolitical tool that's going to embolden bad governance in the DRC. I've mentioned it in my opening statement that we see a slow process in other processes, peace processes, because we have observed that there is a slowness from Kinshasa to move forward, because there is that understanding that the support of Washington is providing them a blank check to do whatever they need to do. So I believe it's very important that needs to be conveyed, that this Washington Accord, the partnership between the DRC and the United States is not a geopolitical tool. The time where the United States was supporting Mobutu against good governance are over. This time for good governance to come.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Jackson, gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you, panelists, for making yourselves available. My first question is to you, Mr. Nima. In your view, does the regional economic integration framework provide enough economic incentives for Rwanda to cease support to the M23 and withdraw its own troops from eastern DRC?
The RIF provide enough incentive for all parties involved to engage in peace and stability in the region, to be part of a development, regional development processes. But at the same time, as I said in my opening remarks, the fact that when you do not include countries like Burundi and Uganda and other countries that are still military active in the DRC for both security and economic reasons, you are putting the seed for further instability in the region. And plus, just as I also mentioned, the RIF itself will not solve the instability in Eastern DRC. It will only address the external element of the crisis without addressing the internal element of the crisis. When you read the RIF, you're going to realize there's very less elements regarding how to strengthen good governance within the DRC in a way that tomorrow or after tomorrow, no external country is going to come and interfere into the countries. And I think that needs to be addressed.
Another question. The agreement requires DRC to undertake specific business-friendly legal reforms to encourage investment. In your views, what additional steps are necessary for DRC to sufficiently improve its business climate and attract U.S. investors?
For me, the goal should not be thinking about attracting U.S. investors. The goal should be about thinking how we should be having a healthy business environment in the DRC that is open to anybody who comes to do right business in the DRC. And for that, the DRC needs to do a lot in terms of mining reform, transparency, revenue management, and transparency in the mining sector. That's key to attract any business to want to come to do business in the DRC. Cuts political interference, cuts corruption, cuts any any form of political intervention. In the case we've mentioned, artisanal miners here. We had reports of artisanal miners being supported by the presidential guards and the mining other big mining activities. Those kind of activities and support needs to be stopped for us to have a healthy mining environment in the DRC.
Thank you. Mr. Hall, thank you, and I appreciate your comments, particularly leading in with what's best for the children. Oftentimes I hear about critical minerals, and we don't talk about the children. I say the wealth of this land in DRC and Rwanda and all these great countries, the wealth is above the soil, not beneath the soil, that this all starts with investment and peace amongst the people. I believe not in the president's doctrine of peace through strength, but peace through righteousness is more scripturally correct. We've seen peace initiatives in the Central African Republic collapse under the weight of weak enforcement and wishful thinking. What leverage, economic, diplomatic, or otherwise, does the United States actually possess to compel compliance from actors who have historically ignored it?
I think you have the legislation before you. If you could pass it, Chris Smith's legislation, if you could pass it.
Il y a
it
une
has
législation que
very
vous avez, si vous
strong
pouvez passer la
language in there.
législation, ça va marcher.
It has penalties, it has imprisonment, it has direction, it has strength. I think also at the same time that I mentioned earlier that we need to educate Americans.
Comme je disais, il
need to
faut que nous puissions éduquer les Américains.
consumers that if my iPhone that I'm going to buy is made with cobalt that's made by
Il faut
children,
seulement que je sache que
by child labor, then I'm not going to buy
les
it.
téléphones iPhone que je vais
When that
acheter a
message
été fait
gets
sur
to
les travaux forcés des
businesses,
enfants
I
dans les
guarantee
mines
you
au
they're
travers
gonna
des Chinois.
change their tactics, and they're going to put pressure
Et ils
on the
mettront la pression.
Congolese, they're going to put pressure on China, and just like we did with the blood diamonds back in the late 1990s, it absolutely stopped the selling of blood diamonds. When we educate our consumers and they start asking the question, is this iPhone made with cobalt, made child labor, which a lot of it is today, 80% of the stuff. This phone is made probably child labor, cobalt that's in this phone right here.
Bon, lui parle seulement des téléphones qui est utilisé avec les minéraux, les enfants, tout ça. Il y a une législation qu'il devait faire passer. Lui insiste sur la législation qui devait être passée. Lui a beaucoup insisté sur l'enfant. Il a aussi beaucoup insisté sur la femme, la violence sexuelle. L'autre noir ici, le Rwandais qui s'appelle Congolais, lui a parlé plus pour connaître le gouvernement congolais, qu'il faut beaucoup de choses au Congo. Il parle des réformes, mais quand on dirait qu'on change la constitution pour qu'on ait une réforme, ils vont dire non, ne changez pas, mais il dit ça. Et puis, il y a l'autre blanc là qui lui parle, lui il dit qu'il faut que le Rwanda quitte le Congo, qu'il y ait des sanctions et coincer des compagnies qui sont en train de travailler, de financer le Rwanda et consorts. Donc voilà, en réalité, les trois personnes, comment ils sont distingués. Un qui est pour le Rwanda, qui s'appelle Congolais, El Kuta. L'autre qui est américain, mais qui est en train de coincer le Rwanda avec l'M23, ils doivent quitter. Et ce papa ici qui est focalisé sur la femme.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, gentlemen, and I look forward into the future where we can have more or some female representation. They're the majority of the population, majority of the workforce, and I think they could be very well prepared to speak on their own behalf. And so with that, thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is facing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. More than 16 million people are in need of food assistance, and millions of Congolese in North and South Kivu have been displaced due to advances by the M23. Before the Trump administration's gutting of USAID, the United States was responsible for nearly two-thirds of the humanitarian response in the DRC, with the vast majority of that funding going towards emergency food, protection, and medical relief. In addition to USAID cuts, the crisis has been exacerbated by the M23, a rebel group backed by the Rwandan government that has committed numerous human rights abuses against the Congolese people as it seeks to gain control over the eastern DRC. Attention from the Trump administration has been welcome in resolving this conflict, but I am concerned about the administration's capacity and long-term commitment to solving the crisis. We've already seen ceasefire violations and disagreements over terms of the Washington Accords, and local civil society and Congolese women and girls were excluded from the agreement. The desire to increase the extraction of critical minerals is central to the administration's support for a peace agreement and strategic partnership agreement with the DRC. In the DRC, mining takes place on both an industrial and an artisanal level. Mr. Nima, can you discuss the differences between these two mining styles, artisanal and industrial?
It's very interesting because the mining sectors in the DRC is taking place in two different spectrums. You have, as you mentioned, artisanal miners and also industrial miners. Looking into the landscape of the mining activities, you see a lot of artisanal minings taking place in eastern DRC, where we have the war in the area of when they exploit not cobalt, coltan, tin, tantalum, and all of that, because it's easy, it's accessible. You also have gold because it's done by the river. But you also have industrial mining where you have capital-intensive activities taking place. That's why we see them a lot in places like in the southeast of the DRC, in the Katanga region, where we have copper and cobalt, because there artisanal mining activities, as much as it's taking place, are not as much as lucrative if they do it in the gold business in the eastern DRC, for instance.
It's critical that we address abuses in the artisanal mining sector, like poor safety conditions and child labor, given our reliance on Congo's critical materials. But despite this, a USAID program that involved direct advocacy with the DRC government and artisanal miners to encourage responsible investment in and sourcing of minerals was shuttered. Mr. Nima, without conflict and atrocity prevention programs, how can the administration promote an ethical supply chain of critical minerals in the DRC sourced from artisanal mines that doesn't drive up violence and actually does promote sustainable peace?
It's true that you mentioned the program the USAID is supporting the DRC has helped to a certain extent and to a certain scope on the mining activities and the artisanal miners in the DRC. But however, the issue that you've mentioned about artisanal miners, the issues is not about nationality or any kind of nationality involved in the mining industry. The issue is about the bad governance in the mining industry in the DRC itself. It's the result of failure of many years to diversify the economy in the way that revenue coming from the mining sectors are spilling over other part of the economy in a way that those local communities are not feeling forced to go to the artisan miners. They can go to school, they can open their own businesses. It's the fact that the mining sectors have lacked linkages in a way that it creates economic opportunities for community around. So I do believe that one of the key elements would be to reform the mining sector in a way that it produce and it yield positive result through diversification of the economy, so tomorrow we don't have artisan miners taking place in the copper and cobalt industry in the DRC.
You're sort of getting at my very next question, actually, which is just that the expansion of the mining sector hasn't led to the kind of prosperity for the Congolese people that we would like to see, and instead, in some cases, has led to forced evictions and of communities and environmental harm. And so I guess the follow-up question is, what precautions then would you take? I mean, you talked about linking it to the broader economic sector in general, more opportunities for people, but what protections would you put in place to ensure that U.S. investment in any country's investment in the mining sector ensures that local communities are treated with dignity, see a greater share of the profits of the resources, and are connected to broader economic opportunities?
This is the interesting part about the mining sector in the DRC. The legislation is there. When you look into the document, you see all the laws and regulations allowing mining companies revenues to get to local communities, to change local communities. But there is a gap between what is written and what is implemented on the ground. And this is, I think, one of the issues that the United States, in its partnership with the DRC, is going to have to look into closely to make sure that any mining activities coming from the United States, an American company, would follow through to those agreements. And this is why I get back to the point I've made earlier, that it's going to be important that those agreements be shaped from an economic perspective for the DRC people, for the DRC advantage, and not from a geopolitical perspective. That may sometimes skew the debate and lead to suboptimal economic agreement between the DRC and American companies that can be involved in those mining deals.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Just a few follow-up and final questions, if I could. You know, when we talk about the abuse of women, 20 years ago, I visited a group called Heal Africa. It's a hospital that specializes in a number of things, orthopedics and all that, but also in treating women who have been horribly raped, often gang raped, sometimes with the husband watching in order to further demoralize him and her, especially her. And Heal Africa does fistula repair for women who have, because of the sexual violence, giving them their life back physically to some extent. But it also had something that I found very amazing, and that was the faith component. The fact that they were so committed to dealing with the spiritual hurt that the woman was suffering, and to let her know, just like we do, Tony, as you know, Mr. Ambassador, in the whole effort on trafficking, to help women who have been victimized to come to a faith reconciliation. They usually blame themselves. These women do not, because it's so, but often in the trafficking space, they do. So Heal Africa is just an amazing asset in Goma, and just so we do, all of us do care deeply about the women, and we try to help wherever we can. You know, a question that all of you might want to take a look at it or answer: why? It's money, it's greed, it's ethnic animosities that continue over the course of decades, years, even centuries perhaps, but greed, what a driver of bad behavior that is. So we need to take the profit out of it, and I think that's why, like you did with the blood diamonds, Tony, we need to make it so that those elements are not marketable if they're coming from a nefarious source where they've been stolen or from a Chinese mine. And I can't say it enough. The modus operandi of Xi Jinping is exploitation in China. I had a series of hearings on what they do in the fishing industry, nothing to do with DR Congo, but learned, and we had this investigative reporting team that did just unbelievable investigative reporting that found that half of the calamari that is on the world market comes off slave labor on Chinese boats. And you can go on and on with each type of fish. It's just, that's what they do. So for them to have a power structure...
Je ne sais pas pourquoi ça a arrêté là-bas. C'est pas moi qui ai arrêté ça. Je ne sais pas si c'est chez eux. On va faire ceci, voir pourquoi ça a arrêté de leur côté. Ouais, c'est de leur côté, ce n'est pas de notre côté. Donc, c'est comme si la communication a été coupée là-dessus. Je ne sais pas, on aura les restes quand ils pourront peut-être remettre ça, parce que je regarde ici, live. C'est comme si ça coupait. Voilà, donc, je pense un instant. Ouais. C'est comme s'ils ont coupé ça. Un instant, je vais encore voir s'il y en a. C'est comme s'ils ont coupé ça. Nous sommes à combien de temps? Je vais voir rapidement. Je vais vous dire ce qu'il y a. Est-ce qu'ils ont coupé ça?
Or answer, why? It's money, it's greed, it's ethnic animosities that continue over the course of decades, years,
je crois que ça va couper de
even
mal l'autre.
centuries perhaps. But
c'est
greed,
là où la
what a
vidéo
driver
est terminée. Donc, ce
of
sont eux qui
bad
ont coupé.
behavior that is. So we need to take the profit out of it, and I think that's why, like you did with the blood diamonds, Tony, we need to make it so that those elements are not marketable if they're coming from a nefarious source where they've been stolen or from a Chinese mine. And I can't say it enough. The modus operandi of Xi Jinping is exploitation in China. I had a series of hearings on what they do in the fishing industry, nothing to do with Deer Congo, but learned, and we had this investigative reporting team that did just unbelievable investigative reporting that found that half of the calamari that is on the world market comes off slave labor on Chinese boats. And you can on and on with each type of fish. It's just, that's what they do. So for them to have a power structure.
Je suis en train, oui, voilà, c'est déjà la fin. Ce qu'on va faire, parce que les vidéos seront très très longues, ce que je voulais faire, c'est de vous ouvrir une autre fenêtre. Maintenant là, je vais vous ouvrir une autre fenêtre. Vous allez quitter ici pour que je puisse fermer cette histoire. Et puis, aujourd'hui, c'est le 10 2026. Et puis, on va commencer notre émission pour que je vous explique réellement ce que je devais parler aujourd'hui. Mais j'ai trouvé que c'était important que tout le monde puisse participer à ça. J'ai beaucoup aimé les débats et je vous dirai ce qu'il y a. Je sais déjà que vous avez vos points de vue et vous avez vu ce qu'il y a eu. C'est bien, c'est important toujours que nous puissions expliquer aux gens. Et j'en profite pour vous expliquer dans l'étape qui arrive maintenant pour que vous ayez une idée claire. Allez, voilà. Donc, vous allez voir sur votre YouTube déjà, pour ceux-là qui peuvent directement aller là-dessus, vous allez voir que j'ai déjà... il est quelle heure? J'ai déjà mis un truc là que je commence dans moins de 10 minutes. Entrez là-bas, je vous arrive maintenant pour que nous puissions parler parce qu'il faut que je puisse fermer cette page-ci. Nous sommes déjà à la fin de celle-ci, donc on doit fermer cette page pour que je vous revienne parce qu'ils ont coupé. La partie des sanctions n'est pas là. Je crois que quand ça viendra à la fin, parce qu'ils en ont parlé et moi je vous reviendrai après avec toute autre chose à ajouter là-dessus. Donc, mais voilà, je suis très content, je suis très flatté d'avoir suivi ça. Et je vais vous dire des petites histoires là-bas. S'il vous plaît, allez-y déjà dans notre salle. Je suis déjà dans notre salle. Je vais vous voir si vous êtes déjà là-bas. Avant que je quitte ici, il faut que je vous voie de l'autre côté. Et puis, je vais quitter ici. Donc, c'était important que vous puissiez suivre, même si les sons n'étaient pas très, très bons. Mais je crois que vous pouvez aller sur leur website si tu veux suivre toi-même. Tu peux me traduire, tu peux mettre les bas de l'écran et tu suivras tout ça. C'était intéressant. Quelqu'un est déjà là-bas, ça c'est charmant. Et déjà dans la page là, aux amis mystiques, Mangwa Saranate. Donc ceux qui sont sur d'autres pages, allez-y déjà là-bas. Je vais fermer ici. C'est même pas important de continuer ici. Merci de nous avoir suivis. Je vous apprécie vous tous et à très très bientôt. Au revoir. On commence maintenant même là.
De notre chère patrie, RDC. Et Kalonji wa Mulumba wa Manye. Loi, loi, loi. Loi va mamwe. Loi, loi, loi. Et loi va trajo. Tout est léger. Amba. Boyoki. Yes. Nalobi na yo mwana Congo. Et Kalonji wa Mulumba est intégré, visionnaire et leader, et rassembleur, guerrier qui ne recule jamais. Devant des problèmes, c'est encouragé, victorieux qui ne recule jamais. Son souci est de voir son pays avancer. Son souci est de voir le Congo aller mieux. Que vive la nation congolaise. Que vive les fils et les filles de la RDC. Que vive la conscience et le changement des mentalités. Que vive la vision dans un nouveau leadership. Vive Kalonji TV, le tigre. Kwisa, kwisa, kwisa awa. Kwisa, kwisa, kwisa awa. Boya, boya awa. Boya. Ça c'est vrai. mtoto wa nchi la Kongo. Kalonji wa Mulumba est intégré, visionnaire et leader, et rassembleur, guerrier qui ne recule jamais. Devant des problèmes, c'est encouragé, victorieux qui ne recule jamais. Loaï bonso, loaï bonso, délégué, et Kalonji TV. Est-ce qu'on peut chanter ensemble? On y va. Tango et Koki. On y va. Tango. Kwisa, kwisa, kwisa. Ba mama na ba papa. Kwisa, kwisa, kwisa. Hey. Beno kwisa kutalane. Kaka justice jenangulaka. Insi. Kaka justice jenangulaka. Insi. Hey. Waswahili wanasema